Okay, so in the last video we looked at where our syllabus fits into our mind map, and then the generic Year 11 stuff with our triune, with our principal beliefs, and then our ethical teachings. And we finished off with talking about how the ethical teachings could be used for any of the areas for our bioethics. So what we need to do is we need to be a little bit more specific with how we focus in. So when we would use a particular ethical teaching in a particular ethical area. Okay, so that's where the next part of the sheet comes in. Now, in order to give guidance to its followers, this has developed over time. So the ethical understanding has developed over time. So whether we have the basic ethical teachings here, and we say that they are in our constant, so these are constant and not going to be changed anytime soon, they are still used when new issues pop up, such as in bioethics. So cloning wasn't around when Jesus was around, but the ethical teachings that were developed in the past of the tradition, and St. Paul was key in a lot of the ethical teachings that were created at the origin, the very early stages of the development of the tradition. But what Christianity needed was to provide reasonable and distinctive responses to any ethical situation, because they're breaking away from traditional Judaism, which had distinctive responses, but to ethical issues, but not a completely exhaustive list. So what Christianity had to do was develop over time how it would respond in a reasonable and distinctive way for any bioethical issue that came up. Now, this is, as Christianity has evolved over 2,000 years, that's where the variants become really important in how they interpret Christian ethical decision making and how their particular variant goes about Christian ethical decision making. So let's look at the revealed law first of all. So the scriptures. Now, this doesn't mean that it's necessarily most important at the top or less important as we go around, or this one's the least important because it's at the bottom. It's just this is the process that most of them will go through. Okay, so first of all, the revealed law, the Decalogue and Beatitudes gives some sense of purpose and the reason that they would and something to base their values on, because they're written down, they're accepted. This is a good basis for us to start from, and this is adhered to by all of the variants. So whether they're, I'll just write in all variants there. Would go to this to get their information. The Protestants particularly would look at the revealed law as their first source of where they would go to get their information. On this side here, we would have natural law. Natural law. And this is, in essence, about logic. So the law that's written in your heart. So that's what St. Paul coined in his letter to the Romans. So it makes sense that like someone your age shouldn't be beating up a 2-year-old, because it just doesn't make sense. There's a law in your heart that tells you that that's not right. The more experienced, so the longer you've been on the earth, essentially, and the more educated you are, builds that law that's written in your heart. So you're able to make connections between different things the more experience you have and the more education you have. When you become a parent, you have a different outlook on things, and the law that is instinctively written in your hearts and therefore becomes logical to you, makes more sense once you've had kids. The more educated you are, especially if you're educated in a particular area, things start to make more sense, and you don't need it explained to you explicitly, that you know what's right and wrong. And this is the area that most Catholics and Orthodox would go to first of all. Okay, so they would just know something's right or wrong before even having to see it revealed to them. But it's not necessarily written down all the time for them. And this human intelligence sense is something that would make sense to us, and it'll be very easy for us to remember, because this human intelligence was coined by none other than St. Thomas Aquinas. And so we're going to easily be able to remember that, but we'll go into a little bit more depth on St. Thomas here. All right. Sort of using this experience from the natural law that we get better at it in a different way, but in a collective term, a lot like Wikipedia, which is a collection of ideas from people all around the world that are experts. Churches use their experience over the length of the tradition to help inform the decisions that they make. So whenever precedence has been set, so this is for our legal studies students, that precedence is used for anything that follows. Well, this was ruled prior to, so therefore it holds a lot of weight. So any of this type of experience is good, because they can use it as an analogy if we're looking at the Islamic Ijma stuff that when we were going through those. And it's adhered to by the majority of Catholics and Orthodox again, probably more Catholic. And sometimes it might not be explicitly written in the sacred scripture, so therefore is not in our revealed law here. So the Pope might put out an encyclical about a topical issue, or pass down a ruling, which we would call magisterium. So that would come from the Pope for Catholics, and give them direction on how to have a reasonable and distinctive response to an ethical issue. The fourth way that Christianity guides adherents in a way to give a reasonable and distinctive response is tradition. And this tradition is using the authority of the church leaders. Now, this is, you should never write in a response that this is a controversial aspect of giving a reasonable and distinctive response, because, as we know, with a lot of the churches have lost the power that they had once upon a time, and that's a good and a bad thing, because some people abused their authority and therefore their power in that. What it can do for especially the Orthodox tradition, who would go here, is they have a thing called, now the Greek heritage people would have pronounced it better than me, or economia, which is the rule of the house. Now, this is an interesting one, because if an individual or a couple or a family or whatever it might be had an ethical decision that they needed to make, it wasn't necessarily distinctive in how they should respond, they've got the law in their hearts, they've used what they could try and find in revealed law, and then the experience of the church leaders or the church over however long, and they still couldn't find an answer for their particular situation. They're allowed to go to their priest or their eparch or whoever it is. But if they didn't like the answer that they got from the person that they went to, they were allowed to go to another house or another priest to try and explain their situation and then get a response to how they should deal with it. If they don't like that, they can go to a third place and a fourth place and a fifth place and essentially go to as many as they want until they get the answer that they would like pertaining to their particular ethical issue. So I don't know how exhaustive that list would be, but they're allowed to go to as many as they would like to get that answer that they want. All right, so that's the process that Christians would go through in regards to an ethical issue that they, or an ethical dilemma that they might be encountering, which in 99% of the cases, between the natural law and revealed law, they'd get an answer for. It'd be the in the 1% of cases where they would maybe need to go to a priest to get the answer, or they might just be lazy, so they want to go to the priest to get the answer because they don't want to look it up for themselves. But most of the time, they would be in these two areas here. Okay, we'll finish this video here, but in the next video, then we're going to look at how we would narrow it down and look at bioethics and how it would be applied in bioethical situations.